Checkout tracking by the NPD Group brings you a receipt collecting system that gathers data anonymously through technology we created, providing your businesses with answers.
I'm going to go really fast. I'm going to cover about 4 million years, hopefully in 4 minutes or so. And I see a lot of you were also here for the previous talk and some discussion of, yes, got some interesting lighting effects here. The previous talk that was going back to technologies from 200 years ago and how that has relevance to the kind of handheld 3D that we've got. But in fact, I really think it goes way, way back. Back before there were human beings, back to our common ancestors. If you think about virtual reality, our ancestors have had to distinguish between those birds and the things that look a lot like birds, except they're, upside down for some reason. And I have a dog who, 14 now, but when she was a puppy, we remember bringing her into the bedroom, and the first time she saw a full-length mirror and saw her reflection in a mirror, and she was startled and started growling and started stalking this strange dog. And by the second or third day, she'd figured that out, and within another day generalized it to other mirrors that she saw. It goes back well into our DNA to realize that what we see out in the world is not necessarily the real thing. And in fact, of course, there are great arguments that, is anything actually real? But without getting too metaphysical, I'll point out that we, not even just as humans, but even as pre-humans, have been having to distinguish between those virtual images and those real images. And the first real VR technology that came about, it's not fire, but I'm imagining people sitting by a campfire perhaps 1 million years ago. Nobody knows when language and speech first became a big thing with our human ancestors. There's a lot of discussion that maybe it was only 100,000, few 100,000 years ago. Given the way that babies learn how to walk about the same time they learn how to speak, and we know that our ancestors have been walking for many millions of years, I tend to go towards the longer view. But the bottom line is the evolutionary advantage of being able to talk about an experience that I had and share it with you, even as I'm doing right now by being able to talk about it, was just immense. And what people did, what those early storytellers did, was figure out how to best give you an image in your head of what I had experienced either in real life or in my dreams or in my imagination. And that's really what it's been all about all the time since then. If you think about everything we've done with technology, at least 40,000 years ago, we were doing cave paintings, and certainly painting on rock with pigments. That's actually a fairly sophisticated technology. My guess is that there were people painting on perishable things like wood and bark many thousands of years before that. And over the time that we've had, of course, we've been working on those techniques and technologies and perfecting them. It's something that people do. Same kind of thing with sculpture, going from scratching images on rocks to incredibly realistic statues and representations of people. Same kind of thing with theater, and now we're only about 3,000 years ago because we can look at the birthplace of modern theater and realize that somebody had this great idea of, hey, here's something that happened between a bunch of people. Let's recreate it and get people, we'll call them actors, and they'll actually pretend to be doing it right in front of you. And even now with modern technology, it hasn't changed that much. It's that sense of being in the room with somebody who's going through this. You just have to suspend your disbelief to know that they're not the real people that's actually happened to, at least most of the time. Same kind of thing, we went from language, verbal language to written language, and for many millennia that was a very rare and difficult thing to write stuff down, to illustrate manuscripts. Then the printing press came around, and in just the last few hundred years we've gone from just a few things being printed to printed materials being everywhere, to now the same books and printed materials are now being showing up on Kindle or your viewer of choice online. And what happened there? Okay. Oddly enough, the slide about photographs had some photographic problems. But photography, now we're talking just last couple hundred years, and how that's gone from still photos to video, and how the technology's gone digital. We keep refining that, and we learn new rules, new techniques to go with that new technology. With film, we went from early film that really was just about 120 years or so ago. Later, you get things like 3D, and you can see that even though a lot of these technological steps take us forward, if you can judge from the expression on the people's faces, sometimes maybe it takes you a step back too. So we're still working that out. But it's quite possible that 3D in cinema, that's so many times tried to take root from the 1950s to the present, who knows, that might even get supplanted by VR cinema. The last speaker was talking about how VR movies might be a big thing, and I have to admit that sense of immersion and being in somebody else's experience is so strong with VR. That's really what we're going for here, and for what people go to movies to see, that could be a great way to go as well. And of course, video games, and now the technology is quite recent, and we're all here familiar with it. It's amazing where we've gone in just the last 30, 40 years, but there's so much farther we can go. And even back then, people realized that this sense of immersion, this wanting to put you into the same kind of vision that I have in my head, maybe we can put it on, a painting. No, let's put it on a screen. Let's have it animate. What if it appears to be happening all around you? The holodeck dream that we've had. And it goes back beyond that. I read science fiction novels in the 60s and 70s that posited the same kind of thing, as I know some of you did as well. And back in 1983, a colleague of mine was speculating on what stuff might look like around now. And we had this cartoon that he came up with. And this was in a book called Shoot the Robot, Then Shoot Mom. And I remember this and actually had to go back to the original author to find a copy of it. But he actually did a pretty good job of depicting what some of these head-mounted displays would look like, considering at the time. Of course, they now look quite different, and this is just a small sampling of some of the stuff that's out there. Everybody here knows what's going on with all of this. So let me see how I'm doing on my timing here. Great. Okay, so too many gadgets. So with VR, the point of where I've gotten to right now is that what we're really trying to do is bring people into this experience, let you see what's inside somebody else's head. And we know there are going to be a lot of problems. So I'm going to shift gears now. I'm going to talk a little bit based on what I've learned. I work with our Project Tango team. How many people here have heard of Project Tango? I'm curious. Oh, that's pretty good. Okay. I mean, it's still getting the word out. We've got about 3,000 developer systems out there. There's not a commercial version like many of the other gadgets. Tango is interesting because it is more of an augmented or mixed reality in that it can do VR with a headset, but it also has sensors in the back that can sense a room in 3D around it, so it gives that device a sense of where it is. But I don't want to get into too much detail on that. I'll talk a little bit more about Cardboard. We mentioned at our Google I/O conference a couple months ago that we had surpassed 1 million copies of it out there and over 1 million downloads of our software to run it. And I haven't seen the latest numbers, but the slope has been great because we just announced it last year. And in fact, it was just 2 people working on it early last year. So it's been quite meteoric, and it's now the biggest installed base of VR systems out there. So right now, what do we have? Well, I think everybody here doesn't need convincing that VR is a major step. But if you think about it in the context of what I've shown you, you see that it really is a smooth line with many other technologies, not just computers and computer games, but really going back even to language. I think it's ready for prime time now. I'm not going to make projections about numbers in the near future. A lot of other people here today are doing that. The 1 million Google Cardboards we have out there, it may not be a blue ocean, but it's at least a blue Great Lake. You know, when you've got 1 million units and you can have that defining game that everybody wants to play, even if it only hits 100,000 of those, suddenly we're actually talking about something that's going to get some press, even make money for an indie developer. And I'm hoping that within a few years that number will be big enough that even the largest developers will be able to do well with it. So I think our blue ocean is getting pretty close. But before we get to that point, so I've talked about the historical side. What can we use from what we learned from history to go forward? Well, with all those technologies I talked about, there was techniques that would improve over time, adding perspective and painting, which didn't happen until surprisingly recently, trying to make it more and more realistic pretty much up until photography came around, and then they tried to make it more surrealistic and impressionistic. It's finding its own niche. We see that kind of evolution all the time. Same thing happens with books and writing, where the kind of content changes when the distribution and the availability to the masses changes. Film has lots of lessons, being able to cut from one viewpoint to another. You know, a lot of you know about this sort of stuff, and I want to get to the meat of the VR, so I won't get into the full details, but there's really interesting stuff going on that we can learn from film. There's one thing I suggest you do as homework. If you know about if you've never heard of the term stage line that they use in film and cinema, it's a fascinating thing, and it's one of those things that if you learn what they do to stage a conversation in film so that you know who's talking to whom, it's something that every professional filmmaker, television person does, and if once you've learned it, you can't unsee it. You know, anytime you watch a dialogue, or in particular, when you see an amateur get it wrong and it doesn't work, it's like, there's something strange about that scene. Now you will know what that is. So look up stage line. It's fascinating stuff. Lots of stuff online about it. But I want to get in. We learned a lot from games as well. That we've had to change as the technology changes and goes from first the computers and arcade machines to then having home computers and mice as one of the major inputs, and a whole new language of how to move and click with the mouse that then gets supplanted on phones and tablets by touchscreen gestures. And it's really time to go beyond that with social gaming. We've had a whole new set of concepts that have come in, and free-to-play has made that actually a way to make it financially successful. So what's going to happen with VR? With each of these new technological changes, you have to come up with these new techniques. What are the ones for VR? So in putting this together, there are several sources that I would recommend. All this stuff has available stuff online because I don't have time to go into any depth at all here. I would strongly recommend you download our Cardboard Design Lab from the Play Store. It is only Android now, although I point out that with the latest version of our Cardboard, it also supports iOS quite well. This is a 10-point tutorial on good practices for VR that's in VR, which I think is just marvelous. The guy that put it together primarily did a great job with it, and it's really fun as a way of seeing in VR what's a good way to go. And I'd also like to thank Jesse Schell, who did a great Gama Sutra article recently, and I talked to him about it subsequently. Chris Pruitt, who used to work at Google, is at Oculus now, that gave a great talk at GDC. Alex Chu from Samsung, who I haven't met, but I found a talk he had online from a couple years ago. I don't believe he's with Samsung anymore, but he was talking about Gear VR at that point. Great talk. And he also quoted Joe Ludwig of Valve. And so all these people have stuff that's available online that goes into more depth about some of the things I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes. But what I want to point out is that I've distilled a lot of the stuff that everyone has come to in common, and that I found in working with our Cardboard guys and working on some games that will be released later this year that all fit into this. So what do we have consensus on? Well, having a comfortable viewing angle is important. It varies depending on the type of system. If you have something like Cardboard, where you're essentially pivoting your body, then you're kind of limited unless you're standing up and turning around. You're limited to a fairly narrow viewing angle. If you're doing something like a Vive, where you're actually moving around 360 degrees, it's much more open, but you've got limitations on how far you can go, and there are cords you have to worry about. Each of the systems has their own different angle, and we're still finding out exactly what the optimum is, and not just left to right, but up and down as well. 30 or so degrees to the left and right of the player seems to be a sweet spot, but as I say, it varies very much depending on the type of system you have. And there's a point that whether it's a head-mounted display, connected to a cord, or something that is cordless and mobile, we have to worry about tiring the player more so than we did when you're sitting at a PC with a mouse, or using your phone, holding it in your lap. People have been able to play for hours. Doesn't seem like that's going to be possible now. So lots of concerns about moving around, rotating. Even if you can rotate, I would recommend not doing it, because not forcing somebody to stand up or to get an office chair that can swivel is a really good idea. Depth cues are obviously critical. There's a bunch of different types. People go into more depth, and no pun intended, in the talks that I mentioned. But just to categorize them, I used to think that there are 2 or 3 things you have to get right so that you don't confuse people about the depth in a VR system. But it's actually quite a few more than that. So for example, you have dynamic cues, like the size of something. The bigger it is, the closer it is that we tend to think that it is. And when they filmed The Lord of the Rings, they did some fun stuff with Gandalf and the hobbits, of just making, if Gandalf looks bigger, you think he is bigger, when in fact he's just closer to the camera. But that's the sense people have. And same way with occlusion. If you see one thing, if you see this hand going in front of this other hand, you know it's closer to you than this hand. And a basic thing, but you can get that wrong, and I'll talk about some ways that people tend to do that. And of course, parallax, in the same kind of way that if you're seeing, mountains moving by, the ones in the front seem to move faster than the ones in the back. It's an old trick that we've used since the old 8-bit days to follow somebody moving along, and they're moving at a certain rate, and a little slower is the near background objects, and then the mountains in the back hardly move at all, and then the sky doesn't move at all. So that kind of parallax, all really basic stuff if you do it right, but you've got to get all of those cues right. And they have to match with other cues, like the perspective of an object. As it gets closer, you actually see different parts of the sides. It's subtle, but the perspective on that is changing, and it looks flatter the farther away it is. And similarly, if there's distance fogging, you need to apply that to all the objects so that as they get farther out, they gray out into the distance properly. That's something I actually did on, I think it was one of the very first games that ever did it, something called Coronis Rift that came out in the mid-'80s, and it's even more important for VR. And finally, probably the toughest stuff are the physical cues that people get from their own eyes and their brain. Certainly the whole stereo focus, the focal depth. Even if you close one eye and you move your hand in and out, you can tell that your eye is actually changing. There are muscles in your eye that are changing to focus in or farther out. And convergence is, of course, the muscles on the side of your eye knowing how far you have to move them to focus on something, which is similar but not quite the same as the sort of stereo depth that you have. So all of those things, if you get any one of those wrong, people may feel a little bit off, or there's something not quite right. If you get several of them off, or worse, you mix them up in different ways, that's when you get into trouble with people having sensory problems with it, not being able to place it in depth, or even possibly getting motion sickness. One thing that everyone has agreed on, and we found it ourselves as well, is the depth that you see a user interface. You have to really put the UI into the 3D world rather than just have it float on the screen in front of you. That's the easiest solution, but it really isn't satisfactory. A lot of people still do it. It's so much easier than having to... It's not that hard to put a UI into the 3D world, but if you put it in the 3D world and then, like with cardboard, you hand the system to someone, and now your user interface is over there and they're looking over here, you have to figure out, do I put up arrows? Do I have something where anytime I click, it moves the interface in front of me, and how does that not look disconcerting? It's not an easy solution, but if you don't do it, if you just say, okay, we'll just pop it up as a flat object on a screen without any kind of parallax, the occlusion tells you it's in front of you because it's blocking out everything else. If it wasn't, you couldn't use the user interface. But convergence, it's the same in both eyes, which means that it must be very far away. But then other things that are not as far away are occluded by it, confuses your brain in all sorts of subtle ways, and that's why you have to get all that stuff right. Even on the simplest thing of popping up a little start menu, it's best to put that into the world there. Motion is another thing there's a lot of agreement on. It's very interesting. With a lot of games, we've learned to accelerate so that if you're clicking on something and then you start to move there, you don't want to just suddenly go at a certain speed and suddenly stop. You want it to be nice and smooth. Well, with VR, you don't. You want to actually have it be not so much abrupt as it turns out that acceleration is one of those things that really throws people off. When their point of view is accelerating, either front to back or turning, that's when you get the most trouble. And those abrupt turns and constant speed turns out to be the best thing to signal to somebody's brain that, oh, this isn't really me moving, this is a picture I'm seeing, and it doesn't disconcert them that way. Keeping the horizon level is really important. You know, as anybody who's gotten seasick has known, they tell you to look out at the horizon, it will calm you down. Well, if you're in VR and the horizon's moving around because, hey, you're in a bumpy ride, let's make the horizon shake, but their body isn't shaking, that's a really bad thing. Having a high frame rate, this was a tough one because when you're using cardboard, for example, you're dependent on a wide range of phones, and some of them aren't going to be as high powered, and you're going to want to add a lot of visual depth there, but do all of this processing I've just described to make sure you get the depth cues right. Very easy to start dropping down in your frame rate. And I've been wanting to say, no, you could probably get by with a good 30 frames per second. And it's all about trade-offs. Maybe in certain cases you'll be able to, but everything I've seen says 60 frames a second is not only the minimum, but you're much better off in VR going much faster than that and downsampling when you have to. And part of that is because particularly it's not such a problem with something like cardboard, where by its very nature it's kind of, you're pivoting your whole torso. So this wasn't really a design plan, but it turned out to be a great serendipity that it's very hard to sort of whip your head back and forth. That tends to give people a disconcerting feeling in VR. It's easier with cardboard to kind of keep up with what's going on, but depending on the VR system that you're using, you want to have really low latency, and the faster someone's head is likely to move, the lower the latency has to be before you can eliminate problems. Another thing is to maximize the control the user has over the way their environment moves, so that it doesn't suddenly move in a way that they weren't expecting, because it is so much more immersive. It's really disconcerting if you see something just on a screen and suddenly the whole point of view changes. Through television and film, we've gotten used to cuts and movement and everything like that, but when your whole world appears to move around you and your body isn't moving, that's a problem. So giving them good expectations. If they can see, for example, a track in front of them and the track pivots, it's nowhere near as disconcerting when you actually follow that as when you don't see a track and for no apparent reason suddenly you're sweeping in a different direction. So one of the games that we're working on currently, we decided to put it on a river, and you're on a boat on the river, and that gave a really clear reason why you could feel comfortable about the fact that you're moving through the environment, but it's not under your control, and yet you can see very clearly when you're going to be turning and which direction you'll be turning in. That was just one technique we came up with there, but I would recommend that you sort of meet players' expectations. So that pretty much covers the simple stuff. I could have gone into a lot more depth. Even at this early stage, there are quite a few things that we developers in general have learned, but these I think are some of the most important and most common ones. And I expect you'll be hearing more of these later today as there are other talks about these things. And certainly the nice thing about the games industry that I'm happy to see is just as strong now as it was 30 years ago, is that when we stumble into new territory like this, people tend to be very open and share this stuff. It would have been really easy for these guys from Valve and Samsung and Oculus to say, no, we're going to keep it all secret. But I love the fact that we're all going out and sharing it with each other. And if anything, I'm seeing more of this with VR than I've seen it in quite a while. There's this really exciting sense of new frontiers. And as you saw with the first half of what I was doing, I really think this is a major shift. This is something on the level of photography and film and everything. So I think we need to work together on this because this is a very big deal. So immersion is amazing. I know I became a convert after seeing Jaron Lanier showed me virtual reality back in the mid-'80s. He was the guy who actually coined the term, and it was terrible then. We saw potential, but it was just not very impressive. But when I tried a Vive, in fact, and also saw the Magic Leap stuff, I just became a believer. The high-level stuff is really amazing. But there is a cost to do that. And because of that, there are lots of surprises. The main cost being having to get all this performance on your systems and the low latency with 2 visual screens that you're doing with all those depth cues. And because there are lots of surprises, we really need to experiment. I've heard this from people before today. You're going to hear it, I'm sure, over and over again. And because you need to experiment, I strongly suggest you start simple and keep these things simple. And I'm not making a pitch for Google, but just out of kind of common knowledge, since we have so many cardboards out there, and because it is in many ways the sort of lowest common denominator, not even just the power of the system, because that depends on the phone, and some phones are quite good, but having one button and you can't even activate it, incredibly quickly, not as fast as tapping on a screen. That is a lowest common denominator in gaze and one-button clicks for interface, which I thought was pretty interesting. And what we've been developing internally, if you can make it work on cardboard, then it actually is quite easy to port it, not just to other VR systems, but if you want to make a game that is on both VR and Android, for example, it's a very quick way to go and not limit your market to the relatively smaller number of VR units out there. So that's just one thought, but certainly not the only way to go. I know a lot of people are aiming straight at the high-level systems. So that's it. That's my Twitter handle. I'm happy to connect on LinkedIn. I would prefer if you use a laptop so that you can actually put a note in there about having seen the talk at Casual Connect, because I get a lot of requests and I turn them down unless I know there's a human on the other end and not just a bot. But thank you very much.
Give it up for Noah. Awesome talk. Thank you. That was beautiful narrative of how we're moving into the next realm, and also super practical advice. Does anyone have questions?
Question is, when you're developing these games and you're testing them with users, are you seeing kind of unique VR game KPIs coming up that you're like, oh, those are great things to track?
Wow. I have to say, from my experience, it's a little bit early. That the first VR-centric game that the group I'm working with is doing hasn't been released yet, so all of our testing has been anecdotal, bringing in other Googlers to work on it, so I really can't answer that yet. In the back there? Are other questions?
Yeah,
sorry.
The question is, obviously gaming also big potential for kids, especially because you guys are also releasing the educational components and so forth. Issue is some, for example, the Oculus recommend 13 plus, but obviously there is huge potential for education, which is probably kids, 6 plus, maybe younger might be an issue. How are you guys addressing that?
Well, we have a program called Expeditions that was announced just a couple months ago. And I don't have a lot of information for you on it, but the demos I've seen, the teacher has a tablet, and the classroom all has cardboard with phones slotted in there, and basically the teacher can take them on trips around the world in VR. And actually, something that probably should get better publicity, but if you go to Street View on your phone, there's a way to tap it to bring Street View up. If you double tap it, it puts it into cardboard mode, and you can then slot it into a cardboard and get a VR view of that spot. And it's great for checking out where you're going. And with Expeditions, you get that kind of thing where the teacher says, okay, now we are in Paris, and here's the Eiffel Tower, and the kids look around and this big metal thing, and it's like, whoa, and just watching their faces and hearing the exclamations is amazing. Because the thing about cardboard is that you see this cardboard and it seems so low capability, and your phone that you play great games, but if you hold it close to your face, it's blurry. Suddenly, it's a whole new world that opens up. So that's one of the things that we're looking at. I did a lot of work in serious games before coming to Google, and I think the potential for education, for training, for just outreach, just giving people a chance to see what the rest of the world is like and understand disasters, for example, by putting them in their first place. I think it has an amazing capacity there.
You don't have any concern about the age? Or you haven't?
Huh.
That is the big issue.
In what sense?
Well, basically, as I was saying, for example, Samsung recommends that only 13 plus. You go some other places that say kids below 13 without no supervision.
See, the only demos I've seen, it's been with teenagers, so I don't know what the details are on that. Sorry, I'll have to pass on that part. But we had another question up here. Sorry, and Nicole, I'm sorry, but he had his hand up from before. Can I hit him first and then get back to you? Just trying to be fair here.
I know.
Hi.
What do you think about putting a virtual nose in the world?
Well, virtual. So there's a lot of interesting things. I think the jury's out of having like a virtual nose, or other people recommend a platform that you feel that you're standing on. And the experience I've had is mixed with that, and not surprisingly, because a virtual nose does tend to sort of center you and give you a sense that you're looking through, this world, or you kind of feel that way. But we can't know what your actual nose looks like, or although now to think about it, that might be kind of interesting. We actually have some way of you making it look like your real nose. Anyway, the illusion, I think, is also going to be different. I mean, I know when I close one eye and I can see the side of my nose, we have that depth thing where, of course, it's blurry and you're sharp. And there are a lot of things that I think would be difficult to get quite right, because just a tough thing. But it's one of those areas where I don't think there's a consensus. I've seen some demos that seem to be better with a virtual nose in terms of feeling like I'm in the world, but they also keep making me think, wait a minute, that's not the way my nose looks. So I'm not really sure where we're going there. Maybe if we do something where you're inhabiting the body of an alien and we can have this big green snout or something, then we can kind of get the best of both worlds.
Cool. Nicole Zauer from Zio Design. Just a real quick follow-up on your question is that the Z-Space is an interesting educational platform. It's not, it's more AR. It's like a Cintiq, and the image comes out towards you. You wear light polarized lenses, glasses. So Z-Space might be an interesting thing. Okay. And then my question, Noah, is just in terms of like all of VR, these are really great. Love the talk. What kind of experiences do you think will lend themselves best to being VR experiences?
Wow. It's a tough one. Certainly what I've found so far is that the emotional, boy, I talk about getting your cues a little wrong and how disconcerting it can be. The emotional depth of VR has surprised me. I find one of the things is that even some of the very simple spooky horror game things, there's something called Chair in a Room that's just a very simple thing I played with. I was shocked at how visceral that was, in the sense of really making me nervous, and I was glad that it was cardboard and I could just put it down and not have to unstrap something. And I think that it's logical that we're so hardwired. Hal Barwood, who came from the movie industry, and he told me about how when they did surround sound, they found out that if you can have a scary sound come from behind someone, they'll jump much higher than if the same sound is coming from the side. And of course, we're hardwired that big scary thing behind you, watch out. Same thing with VR, because it feels like you are in the space in 360 degrees instead of looking at a little screen with maybe a 3D view. I think that it may go to our amygdala that way and really sort of trigger our fears, certainly. And I would hope that the reason that that's the easiest thing is just because that's kind of one of the things we're most hardwired. You got to get the fear right, or you won't survive to enjoy the pleasures or the puzzles or all the other things. But I do believe that sense of immersion being so strong in VR, practically everything that's emotional, the reason you go to a play and see people right there in front of you actually interacting is because we are also hardwired to respond to those people in person. In VR, it's not in person, but I think the 360-degree view and that sense of being there may actually be stronger than what we get in theater for those very reasons. So again, I think it's too easy to tell for sure. I also would love to see having done World War II flight simulators, this is definitely going to be challenging latency and performance, but those are one of those cases where being, in a B-17 bomber and having to man the guns and running around, I love those stories because they're so tense and exciting, and my sense is that VR would be a natural for things like that, but we need to experiment, and it may take quite a while before the technology can keep up with the immersion that we need to achieve that way. Very good. And let's do maybe one more question if anybody has any. No? Well, thank you very much.